It began with a sound, the brittle crack of ice giving way under metal. Deep in the Swiss Alps, a glacier shifted, revealing something that should not have been there. A vault, sealed in steel and silence since 1944. Inside, the air smelled of rust, oil, and time. Faded papers stamped with the Black Eagle of the Reich. Film reels, instruments. A name, Operation Tiefschnee. For decades, it was a rumor whispered in intelligence circles. A forgotten wartime experiment buried beneath snow and shame. Now as the ice retreats and the mountain gives up its secrets, history is about to speak, and it will not whisper. Chapter 1. Operation Tiefschnee. The Glacier Archives. Before the war turned the world into a furnace, Europe still breathed in fragments of peace. In the early 1930s, the Alps stood eternal, silent, white, untouchable. Farmers in Swiss valleys tended their herds. German scientists published in journals about physics and medicine, names that would soon vanish from academic circles and reappear under military contracts. The air was heavy with ambition, and beneath it, fear. Nations were rebuilding and rearming, haunted by the memory of the last great war and desperate to ensure the next one would be theirs to control. In Berlin, the Reich Chancellery hummed with the rhythm of bureaucracy and obsession. Laboratories once funded for civil research were quietly absorbed into the Reich Research Council. Medical institutes, meteorological offices, even universities, all were conscripted into a war machine that had not yet begun to fire. For many scientists, it was an opportunity to continue work, to survive. For others, it was a surrender of conscience. They signed the papers anyway. Fear has a way of guiding the pen. The world outside Germany was watching, yet not acting. Britain clung to the hope that treaties could tame tyranny. France, still wounded from the trenches of the Somme, fortified its borders but not its will. In America, the Great Depression consumed every headline. Isolation seemed safer than intervention, but the warnings were there. In the speeches, in the propaganda, in the rapid rearmament that poured steel and men into factories working night and day. Far from politics, in the stillness of the high Alps, another kind of work was beginning. Hidden among the ridges and caves near the Austrian border, the Reich established high-altitude research outposts. Officially, they were meteorological stations. In truth, they were experimental test sites for endurance, survival, and adaptation to cold. The human body, they believed, could be measured like an engine, pushed past its limits to find the threshold of death. Coded reports spoke of frost physiology trials. Supplies were delivered under night orders. The scientists, many drawn from university clinics, recorded pulse rates, core temperatures, and blood oxygen levels in icy wind tunnels. Their test subjects were not volunteers. Most were prisoners, transported from Dachau under the label special detainees. In official documents, the language was clinical. Exposure sequences, biological observation periods. But behind those words were screams, frostbite, and silence. The Swiss knew something was happening. Border patrols found stray equipment washed down from the mountains after spring thaw. German-marked containers, surgical instruments, sometimes even human remains. But neutrality was a convenient shield. Reports were filed and buried, replaced by trade agreements and diplomatic caution. In the shadow of neutrality, atrocities found cover. By 1943, the research intensified. The Reich was losing on the Eastern Front. Soldiers froze to death in thousands across the steppes, not from bullets, but from exposure. The High Command demanded data: how long a man could survive at -40, how the body responded to altitude hypoxia, how frostbite could be reversed without losing fighting strength. Orders came from the top, signed with initials historians now know too well. The scientists complied. The data, they said, could save lives. German lives. Then came 1944. The front was collapsing. The skies filled with Allied bombers. Somewhere in the high valleys near Obergurgl, an order was issued to seal all experimental evidence in permanent ice storage. The files, the instruments, even preserved tissue samples were placed inside a reinforced steel vault, designed to withstand bombardment and time itself. The code name was Tiefschnee, deep snow. Its location was known only to 3 officers, all of whom vanished in the chaos of surrender. After the war, Allied intelligence teams scoured laboratories and bunkers. They found fragments, charts, names, reports, but the core archive was gone. The Americans took what they could under Operation Paperclip. The Soviets did the same under Operation Osoaviakhim. Each side believed the other had captured the missing data. For decades, historians argued whether Tiefschnee had ever existed. It was dismissed as myth, another ghost of Nazi pseudoscience buried under propaganda and rumor. But myths, as history often shows, are just truths waiting for the right thaw. Decades later, the glacier began to recede. Scientists studying climate change noticed anomalies on radar scans. A large metallic reflection beneath layers of ice, at a depth consistent with mid-century glacial growth. When the excavation team broke through, they found the vault intact, sealed with bolts corroded but unbroken. The markings were unmistakable. Inside lay the evidence the world had forgotten, or chosen to forget. And so a new chapter began, not of war, but of reckoning. The files that emerged from the glacier carried with them not only data and photographs, but a question that echoed across generations. How far will humanity go in the name of science? And how easily will history bury the answer when the snow begins to fall? Chapter 2. The Cold Logic of Experiment. The files recovered from the Tiefschnee vault told a story that was both methodical and monstrous. Typed in crisp, bureaucratic German, each page was a study in order. Margins aligned, numbers precise, language detached. Yet between those lines lay suffering no language could soften. It wasn't rage or ideology that filled those pages. It was calculation, the cold logic of science in service of war. In the late 1930s, as Europe trembled on the edge of conflict, the Third Reich had already begun to fuse its scientific institutions with its military ambitions. The push for self-sufficiency, autarky, extended beyond oil and steel to human endurance itself. The High Command believed that if soldiers could be engineered to survive extreme environments, the Reich could fight anywhere. The deserts of North Africa, the snows of Russia, the skies above England. And so, a simple directive was born. Understand the limits of the human body, and then surpass them. Dr. Wilhelm Schneider, once a respected physiologist at the University of Munich, became one of the project's architects. His diaries, found within the Tiefschnee archive, reveal a man torn between intellectual fascination and moral collapse. The human subject, he wrote in 1942, is a variable no laboratory rat can replace. Only through direct measurement under fatal conditions can truth be observed. His words were clinical, but the reality they described was anything but. Every subject was assigned a number. No names, no past. They were tested for cold exposure, oxygen deprivation, and survival under hypothermic shock. Some were submerged in tanks of freezing water. Others were left in open-air chambers as temperatures plummeted. Their responses were timed, documented, graphed. When they stopped breathing, the experiment ended. Another began. To the scientists, this was data. To history, it became evidence. As the war escalated, so did the pressure. Reports from the Eastern Front painted a picture of frozen chaos, entire divisions immobilized by cold. The German army, designed for blitzkrieg, had no defense against the Russian winter. In response, Himmler authorized deeper research into frost adaptation, a euphemism for human endurance trials. Letters between Schneider and the SS medical branch detail the urgency. Immediate results required. Lives depend on it. They didn't specify whose lives. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence began intercepting whispers of strange experiments in the mountains. A Swiss cable from 1944, long hidden in neutral archives, noted unusual military logistics through Tyrol, unmarked trucks with refrigerated cargo. British codebreakers logged it, but classified it as non-priority medical transport. In the storm of global warfare, even the extraordinary could disappear in plain sight. One recovered document, labelled T17B, outlined a proposed field application. A serum derived from cold-resistant enzymes, tested in rodents and later in human subjects. The serum failed, but the notes included a chilling annotation. Resilience increase of 11% in successful specimens. The phrasing hinted at a planned scale-up, an industrial process for conditioning soldiers like machines. It was science stripped of humanity, progress without conscience. And yet, not all involved were blind to what they were doing. Some entries in Schneider's later notebooks reveal flashes of doubt. "The ice is pure," he wrote, "and yet, in its silence, I hear the dead." In another line, We are recording not endurance, but the limits of cruelty. Historians debate whether these were moments of remorse or self-preservation, the fragments of a man aware that history would one day read his words aloud. As Germany's defeat became inevitable, the records of Tiefschnee were ordered destroyed. But Schneider and his team didn't burn them. They preserved them, not out of guilt but pride. They believed the data was too valuable to lose. The vault they built beneath the glacier wasn't a grave. It was insurance. For themselves, or perhaps for those who might continue their work long after the war ended. When Allied interrogators questioned captured scientists in 1945, some spoke vaguely of mountain experiments. One report mentions a frozen archive hidden beyond reach, but the world was already drowning in revelations. Concentration camps, mass graves, bombed cities. The human mind could only absorb so much horror. Tiefschnee faded into rumor. In the decades that followed, fragments of the operation resurfaced in unexpected places. American aerospace medicine, Soviet endurance programs, even early polar expedition protocols show traces of data remarkably similar to what was found in the glacier. Numbers matched too closely to be coincidence. It suggested that while the archive itself was hidden, its knowledge had quietly survived, traded, copied, reused under new flags and cleaner names. And this is where the morality of history becomes clouded. How much of modern science was built upon the bones of those left in the snow? How much of what we call progress was in truth inherited from suffering we refuse to look at directly? Governments on both sides of the Cold War had reasons to remain silent. The United States, through Operation Paperclip, absorbed entire networks of German scientists. The Soviet Union did the same. The past became property and ethics became expendable. When the vault was finally opened in 2023, the handwriting was still legible. The ink had survived, trapped in dry cold. Names appeared in margins, the signatures of doctors, officers, assistants. Some emigrated after the war, their records sanitized. A few even published papers in Western journals. The same men who froze prisoners to death later contributed to research on altitude sickness and hypothermia treatment. The irony is unbearable, yet undeniable. Inside the vault was also a single photograph, blurred, faded, but human. A man in a heavy coat stands beside an instrument table. His eyes are not cruel, merely tired. Behind him, the mountains rise like witnesses. On the back of the photograph, in faint pencil, 2 words: für die Wissenschaft, for science. It was both justification and confession. The rediscovery of Tiefschnee is not just a historical event, it is a mirror. It forces us to confront how easily morality can be hidden behind procedure, how cruelty can wear the mask of curiosity. And as historians, scientists, and citizens sift through the frozen papers, they find not just data, but a warning written in ice. Knowledge has no conscience until someone gives it one. Chapter 3. The Frozen Front. Winter came early in 1943. By October, the Eastern Front was already a wasteland of wind and bone. The German army, stretched thin, underfed, and undersupplied, found itself facing an enemy that had mastered survival in the cold. The Soviets moved like ghosts across snowdrifts, wrapped in white camouflage, while German divisions froze in trenches carved from ice. And in that frozen silence, the human body became the battlefield. From the recovered Tiefschnee reports, we now know that those long, desperate winters were not just fought with guns. They were fought with experiments. Orders had been sent from Berlin. Field tests the results of physiological endurance conditioning. The command came through coded channels, signed by the SS Medical Directorate. It meant one thing. The data from the mountain experiments would now be applied to the front. In the woods near Smolensk, an improvised test station was established under the guise of a mobile medical detachment. Its official purpose was to evaluate treatments for frostbite and hypothermia. In truth, it was another experiment, this time using soldiers as subjects. Dossiers recovered from the Glacier describe men injected with prototype serums, forced to march for hours through blizzards, their core temperatures measured with crude instruments strapped beneath their uniforms. Some collapsed mid-step, their lips turning blue before they hit the snow. The diaries of a field nurse, Hilda Kraus, detail the horror with haunting simplicity. They said it was to help the wounded, but the wounded screamed when the injections burned through their veins. The The doctors wrote notes. The snow swallowed the rest. Her diary ends abruptly 2 weeks later. The last line reads, "The river is frozen. I hope it holds." Meanwhile, High Command demanded results. Reports travelled by encrypted telegraph from the front to the Alpine facilities. Each failure meant another adjustment, another life spent in the pursuit of endurance. It was science conducted under fire, indifferent to the cold it sought to conquer. But in that indifference lay the true cruelty of war, the belief that the body was just another tool to be optimized, repaired, or discarded. By early January, temperatures plunged to -40. Supplies failed, engines froze solid. The front became a graveyard of steel and flesh. Commanders ordered desperate counter-offensives, knowing their men could barely stand. Soldiers burned furniture, even books, to keep warm. The Luftwaffe tried to drop emergency rations, but most were lost to the wind. For many, death came quietly. A slow drift into sleep beneath a white horizon that never ended. At the same time, back in the Alps, the scientists of Operation Tiefschnee continued their controlled environment testing. Recovered documents reveal synchronized experiments, one group in the field, another in the lab. Each body frozen in Russia was a data point to be compared with those perishing in mountain chambers. This was the convergence of war and research, the transformation of suffering into numbers. And then there was the command bunker in Obergurgl. In February 1944, an encrypted message arrived from the Eastern Front marked urgent. It contained the coordinates of a lost battalion, reportedly exposed for 72 hours without shelter. Their condition, the message claimed, offered ideal natural control variables. What followed was perhaps the most disturbing entry in the Tiefschnee files, a proposal to retrieve the dead and preserve them as frozen specimens for post-mortem analysis. The proposal was approved. 27 corpses were transported by rail under refrigeration to the mountain lab. The manifest called them biological materials. Witnesses later testified that the smell of decay and fuel filled the tunnels for days. When the Allies began advancing from the west, the mountain facility went silent. The experiments stopped. Orders were issued to seal the site and destroy all evidence. The final logbook entry, dated May 2, 1945, reads simply, "The snow will cover everything." And for nearly 80 years it did. But the battlefield itself never forgot. Modern forensic teams, following the trail of the Tiefschnee documents, excavated several field sites in Belarus and Western Russia. Beneath layers of permafrost, they found remains, soldiers buried in uniform, their tissues unnaturally preserved. Some bore marks consistent with experimental procedures, incisions, embedded thermometers, chemical burns. The evidence was undeniable. The frozen front was not only a line of combat, it was a laboratory. The more the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became. These men were not heroes or villains. They were pawns caught between science and survival. Some believed in the experiments, convinced they were saving lives. Others obeyed out of fear. And for the thousands who suffered under their hands, there was no choice at all. War strips away humanity until only orders remain. As the narrator of this history, it is impossible to read these accounts without feeling the weight of their silence. You can almost hear the wind howling through the trenches, the crunch of boots on frost, the murmurs of men trying to remember warmth. Each file, each number was a life, reduced to a line on a page, frozen twice over, once by the cold and again by the secrecy that followed. The climax of Operation Tiefschnee was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a war between the human body and the elements, with science as the weapon. And in that war, no one truly won. The Germans lost their campaign. The Soviets lost millions of lives. But what the world truly lost was something deeper. The boundary between progress and cruelty, erased beneath the snow. When the ice cracked open decades later, revealing the steel vault, it was not the past returning. It was the reckoning that had waited beneath our feet all along. The glacier had kept its promise. It covered everything. But the cold, as we now know, never forgets. Chapter 4. After the silence. The war ended not with victory for most, but with exhaustion. Europe lay in ruins. Cities flattened, families scattered, the air heavy with smoke and disbelief. The soldiers who returned did not speak of glory. They spoke of hunger, of frost, of the long nights that refused to end. And among the ruins, the scientists of Operation Tiefschnee vanished into the cracks of a world too busy rebuilding to ask questions. For years, no one mentioned the Glacier. The Allies divided the spoils of war, carving up not only territories, but knowledge. Operation Paperclip gathered German scientists into American laboratories. Others fled east, finding sanctuary in Soviet institutes. The rest disappeared, some under assumed names, others into anonymous graves. Their research, the data, the films, the calculations, was scattered or sealed. To the world, it was over. But beneath the surface, the silence hid an uncomfortable truth. Much of the post-war scientific progress rested on foundations built by those same hands. In 1947, the Nuremberg doctors' trial briefly touched on the mountain experiments. Witnesses mentioned cold studies, altitude trials, frozen subjects. But evidence was limited, and many documents were conveniently lost. Without the archive, the charges could not hold. A handful of names appeared in testimony, Schneider among them, but with no physical proof, the cases dissolved into rumor. Justice once again froze solid. In the years that followed, the world moved on. Europe rebuilt brick by brick. The United States entered a new war. One fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories and orbit. The Cold War made secrecy an art form. What had once been Nazi science now re-emerged under new emblems and acronyms. NASA, DARPA, the Soviet Academy of Sciences. The rhetoric changed, but the goals did not. Endurance, survival, superiority. These words crossed languages and ideologies with ease. For the victims, there was no closure. Families searched for names that never appeared on casualty lists. Prisoners who survived Dachau's medical blocks described the cold chambers, the feeling of air thick as glass, the sound of heartbeat monitors clicking in the dark. Few believed them. Their testimonies were too horrific, their details too precise. History preferred its villains to be simple, not men in lab coats with pens and charts. The story of Tiefschnee slipped away, a ghost wandering between classified files and fading memories. Then came the thaw. By the early 21st century, glaciers across the Alps began to retreat. Archaeologists searching for lost climbers found instead remnants of war, helmets, ammunition, even fragments of aircraft. But in 2023, when that steel vault emerged from the ice, everything changed. At first, the discovery was treated as a curiosity, a relic of the war. But when researchers opened the containers and saw the Reich insignia stamped across the folders, they understood. This was not debris, it was evidence. Inside were hundreds of pages, still crisp despite the decades. Typed tables of body temperatures, tissue reactions, blood viscosities. Reels of film labeled with cryptic numbers. One clip, restored in 4K, showed a man shivering violently inside a metal tank as technicians recorded data. No sound, just the mechanical rhythm of a stopwatch ticking. It was both mesmerizing and unbearable, the intersection of precision and pain. Governments moved quickly. The Swiss authorities seized the materials, citing international sensitivity. Within 48 hours, US and German intelligence representatives arrived in Zurich. Officially, they were there to assist with translation and preservation. Unofficially, they were there to control the narrative. Portions of the archive were classified before historians could even catalogue them. But fragments leaked online, blurred images, snippets of documents, whispers of a cold program whose results might still influence modern research in extreme environment medicine. The world reacted with horror, then denial. Some argued the documents were forgeries. Others claimed they were necessary history, proof of the extremes war drives humanity to. The debate spread across universities and newsrooms. What no one could deny was the reality of those numbers, the meticulous recording of human suffering in the name of discovery. For survivors' families, the discovery reopened wounds that had never healed. One woman, now in her 80s, recognized her father's prisoner ID in a scanned report. He had been missing since 1944. "At least now," she said through tears, "I know he didn't just disappear. He was taken." Her words carried both grief and closure, the cruel gift of knowing. In 2024, an international tribunal convened to assess the ethical implications of using any data derived from the Tiefschnee files. Scientists debated whether the knowledge, however tainted, should be destroyed or preserved. Some argued it had already shaped modern treatments for hypothermia and high-altitude sickness. Others said to use it was to honor the crime, not the victims. The committee's final statement was cautious. History cannot be undone, but it must not be hidden. The archive was placed under restricted access, stored in climate-controlled conditions, monitored, sealed. Again, the glacier had released its secret, but the world, it seemed, still preferred the comfort of ice. And yet, among historians and journalists, something shifted. For the first time, the name Tiefschnee entered public memory. Documentaries aired, survivors were interviewed. The image of the steel vault became a symbol, not of discovery, but of accountability. A reminder that history, no matter how deeply buried, eventually breathes. In the quiet aftermath, the mountains stand unchanged. Snow falls, erasing the footprints of those who climbed to see the site where the vault was found. But beneath that snow lies a story that refuses to rest. It whispers through the wind that cuts across the peaks, that silence is not peace, and that truth, once uncovered, can never be refrozen. Chapter 5. Echoes beneath the ice. Time dulls memory, but not meaning. In the years since the discovery of the Tiefschnee vault, historians have tried to make sense of what it left behind. Not just the documents, but the questions, the footage, the charts, the handwriting. They are evidence of something more than cruelty. They are a record of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge loses its soul. The glacier is quiet now. The excavation site has been sealed, guarded, its coordinates blurred from public maps. But every year, new researchers file requests for access. Some seek data for climate studies, others for moral inquiry. The ice that once hid the truth has become a mirror, one that reflects not only the faces of the dead, but our own. Because the story of Operation Tiefschnee isn't only about what was done, it's about what we continue to justify when progress demands a price. Decades after the war, Cold War laboratories in both East and West advanced research in cryogenics, endurance, and aerospace medicine, all echoing the data that now lies beneath Swiss custody. In sanitized reports, one can still trace the ghostly fingerprints of those early experiments. The same formulas, the same thresholds, only the language changed. What was once called tolerance testing became environmental adaptation. What was once called exposure mortality became physiological study. The words evolved. The ethics did not always follow. And so, the debate continues. Should the Tiefschnee data be used to save lives today? Could its findings, however dark their origin, prevent deaths in cold environments, in space, in exploration? Or would that be a betrayal of the victims who froze so that others might live? There is no easy answer. Perhaps there never will be, because the line between using history and repeating it is often thinner than ice. Modern scientists, when interviewed, speak with unease. One climatologist who viewed the recovered films described feeling as if the glacier itself was watching. Another researcher said, "The data is flawless, and that's the most terrifying thing." It's not just the experiments that haunt them, it's the precision, the care with which suffering was measured. Humanity's cruelty isn't always clumsy. Sometimes it's methodical. The discovery also forced nations to confront their complicity. When the documents were cross-referenced with declassified Allied archives, it became clear the existence of Tiefschnee had been suspected for decades. Western and Soviet intelligence agencies had stumbled upon traces, yet both suppressed them. Each side saw advantage in silence. The moral outrage we express now was not absent then. It was simply inconvenient. And so, a glacier became a vault for conscience as much as for evidence. For the families of the victims, remembrance has become a kind of reclamation. In Austria and Germany, memorial stones have been placed in Alpine valleys, engraved with the names and prisoner numbers recovered from the files. Each plaque faces the mountain peaks, a gesture perhaps toward those who never came down. In schools, the story of Tiefschnee is slowly finding its way into curricula, not as a tale of war, but as a study of choice. How men of science, trained to heal and understand, became instruments of destruction through the quiet erosion of empathy. When one walks the paths near Obergurgl today, it's hard to imagine the sound of generators, the hum of machines, the cries muffled by snow. The landscape has reclaimed its serenity. But if you stop long enough, if the wind dies for a moment, there's a strange stillness. Not peace exactly, but presence. The kind that lingers where truth has been disturbed. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Operation Tiefschnee. Not the data, not the technology, but the echo. It reminds us that history's deepest lessons are not found in archives or laboratories, but in what we choose to remember and what we refuse to excuse. Progress without morality is not advancement. It is repetition, as one historian put it. While standing before the sealed vault, we dug up more than records. We dug up ourselves. It's a sentiment that resonates far beyond the Alps, because the story of Tiefschnee could happen anywhere. In any era where science, ambition, and authority intertwine unchecked, the instruments may change, the language may soften, but the temptation remains the same, to believe that purpose can justify pain, and so the glacier endures. The vault rests beneath meters of reinforced ice once more, monitored but unopened, its secrets preserved not out of reverence, but restraint. It stands as a monument to a question humanity has yet to fully answer. How much are we willing to forget in the name of discovery? The snow will fall again this winter, blanketing the peaks, quieting the scars. Tourists will ski past, unaware that beneath their feet lies a frozen confession, one written not in ink, but in suffering. History waits below, patient as ever, reminding us in its silence that some truths, once uncovered, can never be buried again.